Now, there seems to be a number of trade wars going on globally. Now, the recent one is Sudan suspending all imports from Kenya in response to Nairobi hosting the paramilitary RSF, which is fighting Sudan's army in a brutal civil war. Now, the Sudanese military government claims that the move is to protect national security, escalating tensions that have been building for months. Kenya, a key trade partner, exports tea, coffee and pharmaceuticals to Sudan, with tea being a major foreign exchange earner. Now, the ban is already disrupting trade, stranding shipments, and also causing losses for businesses and also for farmers. To discuss further on Kenya facing economic fallout and Sudan deepening diplomatic isolation, we have joining us this evening Professor X.N. Iraki. He's an economist at the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And we also have Edgar Odari. He's an executive director, EcoNews Africa in Kenya as well. And finally, we also have a female who is Cynthia Chigwenya, a political researcher and former African Union ambassador for peace for Southern Africa, Pretoria, South Africa. Thank you for joining us on the conversation, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
All right, so let me begin with you, Professor X.N. Iraki. Now, Kenya's decision to host RSF meetings in Nairobi has clearly ignited a firestorm. I would love to hear your thoughts on this and also how you think hosting the RSF meetings in Nairobi justifies such an extreme trade measure.
I think if you look at the trade tiff between Kenya and Sudan, it all has to do with Kenya hosting one of the opponents in the Sudanese war. And anytime there's a war between two parties, there are always some fallouts. So if I'm fighting with you and somebody comes and supports you or supports me, he becomes party to that. So there has been a lot of bloodshed in Sudan between the two contestants, and there are a lot of other parties a lot of other countries who are party to that. So it is unfortunate that Kenya is being seen as partisan in the Sudanese war for a very simple reason. We trade a lot with Sudan. And if you look at all countries in the world, they trade more with their neighbors, whether it is Canada and the US, whether it is Kenya and Uganda, whether it is UK and European Union, we trade more with their neighbors. That's what the theory of trade tells us. So if we continue having this trade blockade or trade tiff with Sudan, it is going to have some ripple effects. And not just across the region, but also in Kenya. Because the exports going to Sudan from Kenya benefit some people along the supply chain, the coffee farmers, the tea farmers, the manufacturers, and so on. So, and the worst thing is, if this continues, then other countries are going to start reading too much into that and say, wait a minute, can we revise our terms of trade with Kenya? Can we revisit how we have been trading with this country? So I think Kenya should be seen as a neutral arbiter because Sudan, Southern Sudan, and so on will always be our neighbors. We should not be partisan. Okay.
Now let's hear from Edgar. Edgar, you've heard what Professor Iraki has actually said. He said he believes that Kenya should be a neutral arbiter. Now we know that Kenya has also defended hosting the RSF meetings as part of peace efforts. But in your view, is there a diplomatic pathway that could actually ease these tensions without resorting to a full-scale trade ban?
You know, first of all, I think it's important to point out that it's one thing, there's a rule we talk about in legal circles. We say justice must not only be seen, it must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. And what is happening here is that the justice, that the kind of view that Nairobi is a neutral arbiter is not being seen to be happening. And having said that, I think it's important to say that yes, I think it's a reasonable measure in the sense that if you have someone who is threatening your national sovereignty in the sense of supporting a paramilitary entity that is armed against government, then it's a reasonable extenuation of circumstances to understand that then Sudan would react in this sense and basically be able to bring that kind of measures against Kenya. So while it is regretted because it's going to cause in an impact on livelihoods, it is understandable because then the actions by Kenya seem to undermine Sudan's sovereignty as a country.
All right, so let's hear from Cynthia as well. Cynthia, what are your thoughts on the trade ban, and if you feel Kenya is being a neutral arbiter here? Because from what we know, the RSF signed a charter in Kenya to form a parallel government in Sudan. Do you also believe that Kenya's decision to host these meetings actually crosses a line into political interference?
Thank you so much for having me, and good evening to all of the viewers worldwide. I want to pick up from one of the points that the professor made in his initial remarks, which was the point of neutrality, and forms part of some of the African Union's frameworks when it comes to conflict mediation and negotiation. And I think a key question here we need to ask is what around neutrality makes the government of Sudan question Kenya's initiatives or efforts in resolving the conflict that has been happening for nearly 2 years now. The second point I want to make is that perhaps it's in reference to the apartheid activist and former Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who says, when you want to make peace, you don't engage with your friends, you engage with your enemies. And I think Kenya's position was critical in that it had access or an opportunity to engage with the rapid support forces. That in and of itself should have been an opportunity to advance and promote conflict mediation in Sudan, which has been at war for 2 years now and has had implications with humanitarian crisis spilling over to countries like Ethiopia, including some refugees being hosted in South Sudan, which is also on the brink of instability. So the first point is on neutrality, and the second point I want to make is also on partiality, which is one of the frameworks or components of conflict mediation. Is the Kenyan actors, and specifically executive power in Kenya, which is President Ruto, seen as an impartial actor in this conflict? And from conversations or some of the developments that we're seeing over the past months is that there is close alignment to the support forces, which brings to question his legitimacy and also partiality when it comes to resolving this conflict, most of which are inundated by self-interest. And then the final point I wish to make is the role of external actors like the United Arab Emirates, which is in two parts, because in recent or contemporary news, we've seen the UAE playing a critical role in the resolution or a possible ceasefire in the case of the DRC and Rwanda, but we're also seeing the UAE being implicated and being accused of playing a part in terms of supporting the RSF in Sudan's case. So there's complexities we're seeing around this case, and I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, let's hear from Professor Iraki. Now, Cynthia did mention, that it should be seen from two angles, whether Kenya is being impartial or being neutral. So do you think Kenya is being impartial in all of this?
I think if you look at the conflict in Sudan in the last 2 years or so, it is between two parties, RSF and the legitimate government of Sudan. So by hosting one party and not the other, and hosting them not for the purpose of mediation or peacemaking, Kenya is seen as not very neutral. And what makes this issue very important is that we all live around the axis of instability. If you look at DRC, you look at Southern Sudan, you look at Sudan, you look at Ethiopia, you look at Somalia, there's a lot of instability there. So, and all these countries are Kenyan trading partners, they are Kenyan neighbors. So for us to appear as not neutral in another conflict, in an axis of instability, that is not the best thing to do. So I think what Kenya should be doing, in my opinion, is to bring RSF, the government of Sudan, neutrally and let them negotiate. Kenya is famous as peacemaker. They have even been sending troops to keep peace in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, and other countries. So that is not a very good image for the country to be seen as not being neutral in a conflict. We should be the people bringing the two countries together so that they can negotiate, there can be peace, and all of us are going to benefit from more trade And as I said earlier, all the supply chains end up going back to Kenya. So if there's peace in Sudan, peace in this axis of instability, we are going to benefit.
Okay. Now, Edgar, I really want to, put this question to you. If you have an idea, would love for you to actually share that. Are there specific threats, or what specific threats, does Sudan claim are posed by Kenya hosting of RSF meetings? And do you think that these claims hold up under scrutiny?
I think they do. I think one just needs to look at the nature of the declaration that was made by the RSF in Nairobi. They were basically talking about forming a government in Sudan.
Yeah.
The nature of and scope of government they want to form in Sudan. So one might want to look at that and ask themselves, now, if you are a neutral arbiter in a situation like this, why would you encourage or basically let one party talk about the formation of government in a situation where there's conflict? So I think that was a bit careless on the part of the Kenyan government, and it would have been better if maybe, if for me an ideal situation would have been, yes, you can claim that you are trying to basically understand both sides. As the good ambassador said, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. But then, bringing them to the ground, to Kenya, to come and discuss these issues, and letting them basically ride roughshod on the process and start having declarations to the extent that they're going to form whatever nature of government they're going to form in the Sudan. I think that is very problematic. And it was a misstep on the part of Kenya diplomatically, and that is going to cost the country because, just like Professor Iraki said, all supply chains end here. And Kenya, I think Sudan is one of the top export countries for Kenyan tea. Yeah. And that's going to be a pretty pinch on the part of the local farmers who supply some of this tea to global markets. Yeah.
All right. Now, Cynthia, Sudan's move has actually already led to the recall of its ambassador to Kenya. How do you assess the damage to bilateral relations when decades of strong trade ties are suddenly upended?
Thank you, and that's a very critical point that is also not divorced from some of the developments we're seeing on the global agenda, with also South Africa's ambassador being recalled from the United States for obviously a very different reasons. But we're seeing the souring of diplomatic relations bilaterally as well as multilaterally. In terms of South Sudan and Kenya's case, I think it has got implications both for bilateralism, which is how then does the government of Sudan and Kenya engage moving forward. Can we anticipate other external actors that should intervene, actors including regional economic mechanisms or regional mechanisms like the Intergovernmental Authority, which is IGAD, where both Kenya and Sudan are members of, but also even economic mechanisms like the East African Community, which Kenya has got the presidency over. So would those be some of the key actors that we're seeing coming in, or regionalism coming in to intervene in this case? And thereafter, can relations between Sudan and Kenya be restored to their previous position? That's very unlikely. But we do anticipate responses, remarks from these regional mechanisms that I mentioned, and hopefully that will lead to some sort of a diplomatic agreement to resume trade. And critical for Sudan, which has been at war for 2 years, I think this also has not just implications on trading and on Kenya's end, but also access to some of the food supplies and pharmaceutical supplies for people that are still in Sudan. And at the end of the day, or at the end of this this diplomatic fallout that we're seeing is that people also in Sudan are at risk of starvation, of hunger, and even limited access to some of the basic commodities that have gotten very little over the duration of the war.
All right, now speaking of food supplies, Professor Iraki, it's not just tea, but also, other foods and also pharmaceuticals, just like Cynthia has actually said, which are vital imports for Sudan. And, there have been reports of unfathomable losses and over 12 million people displaced due to the ongoing conflict in Sudan as well. That's the humanitarian angle. Now, do you worry that halting imports, especially essential goods, could actually worsen the humanitarian crisis on the ground?
I think as we talk, if you look at what's happening in Sudan, what is happening in a war situation, whether it's in Sudan, whether it is in Gaza, or whether it's in Ukraine, war always has very negative consequences on the ordinary life of citizens. So when you start cutting off trade, it means that even essentials like food and medicine will be affected. And it is even worse when you are cutting off such essential supplies, food and pharmaceuticals and drugs and so on. In a war situation, war already is bad enough. So when you add now these other essentials not reaching that country, it becomes very bad. If you look at statistics, for example, and I've been to Sudan once or twice, Sudan is not one of the richest countries. It's not one of the top countries in terms of economic growth. So we are making a bad situation worse. And that's why I'm saying at the end of the day, the neighbors should be helping this country. We bring peace so that there is peace for the ordinary citizens. So it is very, very, very unfortunate that instead of helping that country get peace, so the children of Sudan, the elderly of Sudan, everybody in Sudan is suffering. So we should not be making the matter worse. We should actually be helping that country make peace so that everybody, all the vulnerable members of the society are not affected as it is happening now.
Well, I totally agree with you on that, Professor Iraki. And you did talk about, statistics. Still on you, Professor Iraki. Do you have any projections on how much Kenya's economy might contract if trade with Sudan falls sharply?
I'm not sure. I don't have the statistics, but what I know is from the gravity theory of trade, you trade more with your neighbors. The key trading partners, as far as Kenya is concerned, is Uganda and Tanzania. But we have substantial trade with Sudan because it's very near us. But the problem is I may not have the data, but you have to think about the ripple effect.
Yeah.
That if you don't trade with Sudan, other countries might take the signal and not trade with Kenya. And that will have a magnified effect compared with just comparing Sudan and Kenya trade.
So it will disrupt, ripple through, the regional market is what you're saying?
Yes, and that is my biggest concern.
All right, now let's hear from you, Edgar. Do you agree that it's going to ripple through, regional markets? Because economist Ken Gichinga actually warned that this particular ban will be a big blow and foreign exchange will also take a hit. So what are the financial impacts, that this could have on Kenya's economy, especially in terms of foreign exchange earnings?
I think it's going to have an impact. Well, I may not have the figures with me on my fingertips, but what I can say is that, first of all, Sudan is one of the top 5 export destinations for Kenyan tea. Let's just talk about tea alone. Now, tea is significant. Then you also have to talk about food items and pharmaceuticals. These are significant exports, and while they may not contribute significantly to the overall foreign exchange basket for the country, there are significant losses. And beyond that, again, you need to look at it in terms of the impact the ripple effect is going to have on various actors. So you have you just look at it in terms of foreign exchange. But then what about, for example, the farmers? Because now prices are going to be depressed, and the farmers who have been earning their keep from the export of tea and tea products to various markets are going to suffer, because I think I've not checked the prices today, but if you look at the tea auction, the price is actually depressed because there's a glut in the market because you do not have a destination for some of these products to go into a country like Sudan, which, like I said, is among the 5 export destinations for Kenyan tea. So because of that, then you have a ripple effect where something happening that looks like it's disconnected in Sudan has an impact on local farmers in the region. Then beyond that, you also need to look at the question of pharmaceuticals. These are essential supplies that are actually helping the country in terms of the kind of health concerns that the citizens of the country may have. Now, if you do not have a supply of essential medicines that are supposed to help this population to be able to fend off diseases, then you're going to have a situation where the disease burden is going to be increased, so that beyond the ripple effects of having exchange gains or exchange losses, you're also going to have farmers suffering. You're also going to have the population in Sudan suffering, and this is something that needs to be addressed before it escalates further, I think.
Okay, now I love that you actually broke that down for us. Still on you, Edgar, there have also been reports of containers already stranded, at Port Sudan, and also large stocks, stock in Mombasa. What are the immediate logistical challenges for both nations? And also, if you could shed light on how prolonged storage and also unsold inventory might affect Kenya's overall trade balance.
Yes, so first of all, you also need to look at demurrage charges. When these containers sit at the port without going to their destinations, there's actually a costs implication for the people who are exporting these products to the regional market. That's the most immediate impact. Now, the other thing you need to look at is you're going to clog up the port such that instead of having other products that are supposed to be exported to other markets, that space has been taken up by products that are not moving. Inventory is not moving out of the designated space. So because of that, then you're going to have a slowdown in terms of the kind of export oriented structure of the market that you have, in a sense that what would have been exported maybe in a period of 1 week may take longer, and that has implications in terms of the kind of charges that are accrued to the port, as well as the supply chain disruptions generally, because sometimes with these global supply chains and regional supply chains, delaying supply of products by even 1 week is going to have significant changes, because some of those products are relied on to be able to feed on to other industries in that sense. Yeah.
All right. Now let's hear from Cynthia. Cynthia, RSF advisor, that's El-Bashar Tabay, claimed on X, that's Twitter, formerly Twitter, that the group would guarantee the smooth passage of Kenyan goods into Sudan in areas under its control. Now, given that the port Sudan is currently held by the army, how credible is this guarantee amidst ongoing conflict?
I'll respond to that in two parts, which is first, what is the legitimacy of such a claim being made by paramilitary group and giving guarantees to government in Kenya, and does the Kenyan government, despite the guarantees that they have received, want to continue trading with Sudan under circumstances where the Minister of Trade has come out to announce a trade ban that is effective immediately? And my advisory suggestion would be that it would be very detrimental for Kenya, despite guarantees that have been offered, to even continue trading in Sudan against what the government has proclaimed or stated through the Ministry of Trade. The best way forward would actually be for Kenya to try and resolve relations with the government of Sudan, if indeed President Ruto is acting in the best interest of peace in the region. Doing so would ensure that Kenya returns to its position to be able to negotiate peace within the region, but also it offers more durable prospects for continued trade relations and diplomatic engagements with Khartoum.
All right. Now, I'm taking it from where you said the best thing to do is for Kenya to try and resolve issues with Sudan's government. And this next question is for Professor Iraki. Now, President Ruto, has been criticized for his close ties with the RSF, no doubt, right? And you hear Cynthia saying this, and it's the best solution at the moment. So how do you think this ban will intensify political pressure at home in Kenya and also alter public perceptions of Kenya's foreign policy?
I think I like what Ambassador Cynthia brought about, that what legitimacy does RSF have to say we are going to guarantee the passage of Kenyan imports through Sudan? Because what legitimacy do they have to say that? But to get to your question, I think this ban is going to put pressure on Kenya to become a neutral arbiter, to participate in peacemaking in Sudan, for a very simple reason. If we don't have a lot of exports in Kenya going to Sudan, you're not going to create a new market for those goods immediately. It takes a lot of time to create a new market for goods and services. For example, if you have been exporting some things to the US and the US stops importing things, or South Africa or Pakistan, you're not going to get an immediate market. So what is likely to happen economically is that there will be a glut in that particular product. For example, you find there's a lot of tea in Kenya than expected to be exported. So what is going to happen is there will be a price. There will be a fall in price of tea and other commodities because of the lack of market. And that is going now to play back into politics. For example, the tea farmers, the coffee farmers, who are key voters, who are key constituents in political gigs so in Kenya, are going to start arguing, wait a minute, why are we getting low prices in tea? Why are we getting low prices in pharmaceuticals? Why are we getting low prices in this and this commodity? So I think in the long run, such a ban is going to put pressure on Kenyan executive or Kenyan presidency to start thinking of how they can resolve the stalemate in Sudan instead of being a participant. I also think that there might be an international reaction to Kenya being partisan. What is the US going to say about it? What is Russia going to say about it? What about European Union? What about the other key trading partners with Kenya? They may put pressure on Kenya and say, wait a minute, you cannot start trading with a government that is legitimate. So I think in the long run, this ban might make Kenya look at the position as far as trade and the cost around the supply chain in politics is concerned.
Okay, Edgar, just to reiterate what Professor Iraki has actually said, do you think that this ban can be seen as Sudan's attempt to leverage, economic pressure to force Kenya's hand in resolving the RSF issue or being neutral?
It is. It is very good leverage because if you think about it, what is more powerful than your constituency telling you that we need to do business as usual, try to resolve some of those issues that you have with your neighbor? And I think it leads to, if you look at the structure of the World Trade Organization, one of the key aspects that they have to use is the security exception. And so, you can ban products from being imported into your territory and use the security exception, except that it is usually very difficult to sort of use this provision. But by the time a country has actually gone ahead and been able to use the security exception in terms of banning imports, then that country has gotten to a point where you want to really leverage on the kind of situation you have. So having said that, knowing fully well that Sudan is one of the top 5 export markets for Kenyan tea, that is bound to pinch. And, I don't have the figures for the pharmaceutical industry, but we have a very robust pharmaceutical industry that employs a significant number of people. But then the ripple effect, if you look at it from the agricultural value chain especially, is quite significant. So I think Sudan chose the right levers to be able to pull this situation, and the leverage they have will be able to bring Kenya back to the table to negotiate.
Okay, let's hear from Cynthia. Do you think this leverage will be able to bring Kenya back to the table? And if so, what might be the risks and also the rewards of this approach?
Thanks again, and I'll pick up from the professor's analysis, which is that it is a good leverage in terms of engaging with the government in Kenya. There's pressure from Sudan itself, but there's anticipated pressure from traders and business partners within Kenya. And also, I think one of the issues we cannot have oversight over or we cannot underestimate is also the role that even the Kenyan population could play in terms of questioning the executive of the decision of the executive, rather. So we could have mounting pressure both domestically and also from the outside. My concern and the biggest implication, which we have seen over the years when it comes to conflict context, is that it happens at the cost of lives and livelihoods, particularly in a case that is already, or in a country that is already at war, and basic commodities have seen a rise and they're quite scarce. This trade ban could come at a big expense to the population and the people in Sudan. But in terms of pressure, there's definite pressure that will be going to Kenya, and I think it would be in the interest of the government of Kenya to resolve its relations and repair its relations with Sudan.
All right, now, Professor Iraki, earlier you agreed that, this ban would ripple through regional markets. Now, can you tell us what kind of message this sends to other regional partners in East Africa about the use of trade restrictions as a political tool?
That's an interesting question because we haven't had a lot of trade disputes between East African countries, except maybe between Kenya and Uganda. One time over, I think it was over eggs. There was also one between Kenya and Tanzania. I think it was over maize. So most of the trade disputes have not involved war. They have just been involved tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So this is quite unique using tariffs, using such leverage when there is partisan reaction by the Kenyan government in terms of the Sudan conflict. So, but when you look at the trade disputes, you notice that if you look at the East African region, we are supposed to trade a lot with one another. And that was the essence of East African community. It was the essence of SADC. It was the essence of African Free Trade Area. So when we start having such disputes, when we start having such trade bans, it negates the essence of having regional blocks. And countries are going to start questioning themselves that if this can be done, who will be the next? Because we find DRC doing the same. We find another country doing the same. So it's not just a question of what the Sudan have done, but the symbolic part of it, that countries can use such extreme measures to solve political and economic political disputes. And that signal effect, whatever people are seeing that being used for the first time, is going to start slowing down the trade. And that's not what we want. We want trade to expand, create jobs for everybody, and have people live in peace.
All right, let's hear from Edgar. Still same question, on, what message it will send to regional partners in East Africa. That's talking about the ban and all that, because some critics have actually argued that this particular ban is actually more symbolic than substantive, that it's aimed at sending a message rather than addressing real security risks. Let's hear from you.
Well, you may call it symbolic, except, like Cynthia said, it has real life implications for the livelihoods and lives of real people. Now, like I told you, the prices at the tea exchange have been depressed. And beyond that, then you have pharmaceutical supplies being limited in the Sudan. Now, beyond that, how they can be able to send a mixed signal to other countries. DRC has a long-standing issue with Kenya. And, just looking at the way that has been played out, it is entirely possible we'll have the DRC waking up tomorrow and saying, you know what, maybe we need to put that kind of pressure. And, Kenya has invested heavily in the Congo. And, you have banks, then you have small businesses that have gone there. Now, if they were to turn that tide and basically say, look, we are going to ban maybe Kenyan banks from operating in this place, that has huge implications on the kind of investment that have been done across the region. So all I'm saying, I think I agree with Professor Iraki that is likely to signal to other players in the region that maybe you can be able to use, security exceptions and trade wars to be able to basically leverage your way out of a negotiated settlement. Yeah.
Okay. Now we're about winding down, and Cynthia, would love to hear your final thoughts. But if you could actually add to how you think this would actually reshape not only Kenya-Sudan relations, but other countries' relations.
I think one of the biggest blows, apart from anticipated economic shortcomings, which perhaps the government of Kenya could buffer by getting funding or support from other external actors in the war in Sudan, I think it really erodes on Kenya's ability to be a regional player within the East African community. And I think that has got implications, especially following its loss in the bid of the chairmanship of the African Union, and now these developments that we're seeing in terms of Kenya's power hegemony to influence other countries in the region. That could be at greater impact if the current government continues on this trajectory. And that is adding also to some of the bouts we've seen with the protests, the Gen Z protests that have again questioned the legitimacy of and sincerity of President Ruto. So we're seeing this trend in his presidency, and I think it puts both the presidency as well as the country in negative light that, not just within the East African community, but also curious to see how other African nations are going to respond, especially if Kenya is to act on the guarantees that it has received from the rapid support forces to continue trading with Sudan against the government's denouncement.
Okay. Professor Iraki, let's hear your final thoughts. And can such a drastic step ever be reversed without long-standing consequences?
It's unfortunate we are talking about trade dispute between Kenya and Sudan when what is in the headlines nowadays is tariffs from the US and from President Donald Trump. So it's not just between Kenya and Sudan. Trade has become a big issue. And if you look at trade among African countries, it has always been very low. We don't have as much trade as expected between African countries. And we expected that through African Free Trade Area, there'll be more trade and more jobs and higher standards of living for the African citizens. So what we probably want is, we want African countries, whether it is Sudan, whether it is Kenya and so on, make peace so that we can always benefit from peace dividends. And very important, if Kenya can make Sudan peaceful, we are going to get economic dividends and our national image is going to improve. So let's help Sudan make peace and we are going to reap economic dividends.
Okay, now let's hear from you as well, Edgar. Your final thoughts on this?
I think it's unfortunate. We don't seem to have a practice where countries actually sit down, craft foreign policy, and actually sit through and follow through on that kind of foreign policy structure. Because Kenya has recently passed it's revised its foreign policy, but what we are saying is you don't have there's paper and there's practice. We don't have a nexus between what is on paper and what's actually being practiced, and it's unfortunate that this has come to this point. I would actually urge that the country goes back to its traditional diplomatic status and role across the region. Otherwise, then we have too much to lose in terms of, if we lose that credibility across the region, there's more implications than just losing that ability to be called, a place that promotes peace across the region. There's much more at stake than just being called a country that basically promotes peace and peacekeeping across the region. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen and lady, for joining us on the conversation this evening and speaking to us on this. We really appreciate you for your time. Professor Edgar Iraki, economist, University of Nairobi, Kenya. Edgar Odari, Executive Director, EcoNews Africa in Nairobi, Kenya, and also Cynthia Chigwenya, political researcher and former African Union Ambassador for Peace for Southern Africa in Pretoria, South Africa. We appreciate you once again.
Thank you, and have a good evening.
And with that, we've come to the end of the conversation. Thank you so much for staying tuned. Do not forget, you can watch News Central live on DSTV channel 422, on GoTV channel 23, Star Times channel 274, Avo TV, and YouTube. Until I come your way again next time, I'm Darshan Usman. Thank you for watching.